From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Please, if you're not subscribing already, make sure you do on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're in the mood, please leave me a nice review. This week, well, we're just 3 weeks into the Trump administration, and are we already in a constitutional crisis? That certainly seems to be the view of some of the more alarmist commentators around. Many of President Donald Trump's early actions on multiple fronts have been challenged in the courts, and in a number of cases, judges have already blocked the administration from executing its plans. A number of cases on birthright citizenship for the children of migrants, on the invitations to federal employees to quit their jobs, on stopping the movement of trans women to men's prisons, and dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Perhaps most dramatically, a judge has ruled that Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency team is ruled that they be denied access to the Treasury Department's payment and data systems, obviously seen as critical for their ability to do their job. Now, Trump officials have pushed back, most notably Vice President J.D. Vance, who posted on X last week a note that read, "Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." So, is this a full-blown constitutional crisis, or just part of the now pretty normal process of presidents testing the bounds of their legal authority? Well, to answer all these questions, I'm pleased to say this week I'm joined by John Yoo, welcoming him back to the program. John served in the George W. Bush administration in the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, where he played an important and, to some people, controversial role in the development of anti-terrorism policy and surveillance programs. John is now Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. And John Yoo joins me now. John, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Oh, it's great to be with you again, Gerry. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, thanks for being here. So let's get straight into it. A lot of people are saying we're in a constitutional crisis already, 3 weeks into the Trump administration. All kinds of challenges, all kinds of blocks judges have placed on a lot of the things that President Trump tried to do. Is this a constitutional crisis?
No, I think what we have is people forgot for the last 4 years during a comatose presidency what energy in the executive looks like. That is Alexander Hamilton's phrase in the Federalist Papers when he explained why did the founders concentrate so much power in a single person, the president. And he said it's so that we could have, these are his words, speed, activity, decision, so that we could have energy in the executive. And Hamilton said the very definition of good government is energy. And so what you're seeing now is not a constitutional crisis. What you have is the regular workings of the separation of powers. You have a president coming off a decisive win who has an agenda. He feels the American people behind him endorse that agenda. He's pushing forward through executive orders. You have people unhappy with it going to the courts, just like, I might add, Republicans went to the courts to oppose Obamacare or to oppose Biden's student loan forgiveness. And this is going to press forward, I hope quickly, to the Supreme Court. Now, the missing actor in all this is Congress. I think what the founders really expected was that Congress would, if it didn't agree with the president, fight with the president, come into conflict, have hearings, cut off funding, so on and so forth. But so far, Congress isn't present, actually, because I think the majority in Congress agrees with Trump. And so you have people who are on the losing side turning to the courts. That's always the place of last resort.
So what you're saying, in effect, is Congress could help to sort of at least resolve or maybe at least smooth this path by passing legislation that would actually enact in law some of these executive orders. Is that what it could do?
Oh, yes. For example, take all this controversy over Elon Musk and his DOGE committee. Now, if Congress were really doing its job, if it really were passing laws, if it really were passing, for example, individual laws funding each department instead of rolling it up into the mother of all spending bills once a year right before the funding deadline, DOGE would go to Congress and say, here's a list of 30 things that Congress should consider. But Congress is nowhere to be found, so who has to do the job? The executive branch. And this is something that many observers have talked about. If Congress isn't going to be out there passing legislation, having hearings, right? They could do all of President Trump's executive orders if they wanted to. And the American people want reform and progress. Well, then it falls to the executive branch because everyone's going to hold President Trump responsible for how the country does over the next 4 years, whether Congress gets involved or not. So President Trump is reacting as every president has reacted when there's a power vacuum because Congress doesn't want to, for example, do its funding job. It doesn't want to, right, vote more money for the border. It doesn't want to get our defenses in shape. Right, doesn't want to reform our spending and get our fiscal house in order.
So is that the situation then? Is that the constitutional picture that if Congress doesn't act according to within its authority and within its powers to pass legislation that the executive is then constitutionally mandated to enforce, that the executive can just go ahead anyway and say, well, maybe this is a congressional issue, but, they didn't act. I've got to run the country, so I've just got to get on with it. Surely there are some limits there. The president couldn't just say, you know what, I'd really like Congress to pass this tax cut or this spending increase that I want to get done, but you know what, we don't have time, I've got to move, so I'm just going to do it anyway. There are some limits, aren't there, on what the president can do?
So, Jerry, that is the heart of the matter. That is the right question to ask. Is the founders didn't expect this. They actually thought the most powerful branch and the branch most dangerous to liberty was going to be Congress. In fact, James Madison called, Congress this vortex that's always sweeping in power and potentially infringing on our liberties. But what they didn't anticipate is what you describe, a Congress that's not there. Congress that political science say Congress has turned into people who are more grandstanders, who want to get public attention and be on TV and run for higher office and not do the hard work of legislating. So one thing I ask is, how did our constitutional system react to this power vacuum? Progressives wanted all this power to flow to the executive. They wanted to have experts in control. You could say the poster boy for the progressive vision of what to do here is Anthony Fauci. You have an emergency. He's a scientific expert. He basically sets out rules that govern the whole country and the economy for more than 2 years. I don't think that's the right model either. So I think you're right, Jerry. We have to say at some point, the only way maybe to get Congress to do its job is for presidents to stop and say, I'm not going to try to dictate when everyone goes to work or whether everyone gets a vaccine during COVID. I'm going to leave it to the states. And if we need a national solution, then Congress has to do it. So I agree with you. The president can't do everything. He can't, for example, say, I'm going to set tax rates at this amount, or I'm going to pull this much money out of the Treasury, or I'm just going to unilaterally decide how many divisions to build and how many air groups to have. Those are still up to Congress. I think that the only way to fix the problem, though, is that a president and the voters have to thrust the responsibility back on the legislature.
So when people talk about this being a constitutional question, again, President Trump has been unusual in terms of the speed and the scale of the number of executive orders he's introduced in a couple of weeks. But this is just a normal process, in your view, of a president seeking to exercise his executive authority in a whole range of areas, some of which may be challenged legally, some of which won't be. And ultimately, is this a matter for the courts to resolve? Or, as you say, assuming Congress isn't going to act, is there something else that decides this?
So, Jerry, I listened to your podcast, and one thing I've learned from your podcast is that we should pay attention to what Trump does, not what he says. Because what he says is often much worse than what he actually does. And so I do think that when you look at what Trump is doing, this is just the regular fighting between a president and the Congress and the courts over leadership, over their constitutional powers. But of course, you have Trump out there saying, well, I'm just going to fire people. I'm just going to cut the budget, which he can't do alone. So that when you take his rhetoric, or say, for example, J.D. Vance saying courts can't intrude into the legitimate powers of the executive, which I think is right. But when he says it the way he said it, people get worried. Oh, is the executive branch actually going to defy the courts, refuse to carry out a judicial order? People on the other side of the Trump administration, they will exaggerate that into this constitutional crisis. But when you look at it, it's as you say, Jerry, these are fights over the boundary between the executive power and the legislative power, and it will go to the courts. And I think Trump's going to lose some. For example, I think he's going to lose on birthright citizenship, but he might win one. Impoundment, for example. If all Trump is doing is just freezing spending temporarily so he can get his handle on where the money is going and whether it's consistent with national priorities, but Congress still decides how much to appropriate, Trump still has to spend it. He just can't spend it on unconstitutional things. He doesn't have to spend money that interferes with national security and his foreign policy. Then all he's doing is asking the courts to reconsider whether impoundment by presidents is constitutional or not. When it comes to cutting spending or this early retirement program or trying to expand his power over the ability to fire executive branch officers, again, He's not running it like a dictator. He's actually just going to the Supreme Court and saying, will you reconsider things that you allowed in the past or prevented presidents from doing in the past? Now, I think it would be a constitutional crisis, Jerry, if Trump actually lost at the Supreme Court and then said, well, I'm going to fire these people anyway, or I'm not going to spend the money Congress is ordering me to. Then you do have a constitutional crisis. But I don't actually think Trump or Vance have said that that's what they're going to do. I think his opponents have exaggerated their comments into that.
We'll take a short break there, but when we come back, I'll have more with John Yoo, who is professor of law at Berkeley and, of course, was a prominent lawyer in the George W. Bush administration. And we're going to be talking about the legal challenges to President Trump's early actions, the measures by some of the judges that are in blocking them. And we're also going to talk not only about whether or not might be a constitutional crisis, but more broadly, what are the reasons why we seem to have now so many of these cases, not just under President Trump, but under previous presidents, where the president is running up against the courts. So we'll be talking more about that. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with John Yoo, professor of law at Berkeley, and we're discussing whether or not the US is already 3 weeks into the Trump administration in the midst of a constitutional crisis. I want to get on to some of the specific cases in a minute, but just quickly stick on this broader question of what is the scope of executive power here. Reading J.D. Vance's kind of infamous post on X, which got a lot of attention and, again, as you say, get everybody's hair on fire and said, oh my goodness, they're going to sort of usurp power. This is what he said in the relevant part. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. I've been reading that, forgive me, but that actually sounds like a tautology to me rather than a kind of provocative thing to say. If the executive is exercising power legitimately, then of course judges can't control it because it is, by definition, it's in line with the law. Isn't that right?
Jerry, you get an A+ in Constitutional Law 101, my friend, because a lot of students, a lot of good that does you, right? You get a free cup of coffee for that. Yeah. So a lot of students come into class thinking, oh, the Supreme Court controls everything. But when they leave class and they read about the scope of American history, they read about what presidents and courts have fought over before, they come away with your view. Well, of course, in their own spheres, each branch is supreme. The other branches can't tell each other how to do their job. The president, for example, can't tell the Supreme Court how to decide cases. That's the Supreme Court's authority. The Supreme Court can't tell the president, you have to invade this country, or you have to prosecute this person. The commander-in-chief power and the power to enforce the law under the Constitution are the president's. What J.D. Vance is saying is no constitutional revolution. This is actually something that goes back to the very founding. Not only have presidents said this, as our greatest presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, all said things very similar to what Vance said. But who said something outrageous like this? Here's a phrase. The president is invested with important political powers. He is accountable only to his country and to his own conscience because the subjects are political. The decision of the executive is conclusive. Who said those outrageous words? Chief Justice John Marshall. And he wasn't writing a little note in his journal. He said that in Marbury versus Madison, the very case that recognized judicial review. So even when the Supreme Court itself was saying, we have the right to reject unconstitutional laws, John Marshall also said exactly what Vance said and what you said. But there's certain powers the president has, the exercise of which is up to him, and courts have no right to review it. So the question is not really whether what Vance said is right. It's how does it work out at the margins when that runs into what Congress does, or where it's a power that the president and Congress share. That's when the court should get involved, and that's when the presidents have the right to fight. But, the idea that the federal courts have the right to order the president, whether to fire someone, whether to prosecute someone, whether to wage war, misunderstands constitutional law and history from our very beginnings.
I'll continue to try to be the good student, John, but let me ask you then, because you raised this, again, where we could have a constitutional crisis, obviously, is if any of these cases, presumably some of them will get as far as the Supreme Court, maybe all of them will get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules against the president, and the president says, am I not right in saying there is precedent here? Was it Andrew Jackson, I think, who said, well, the court may rule now, the court may have issued its judgment, now let it enforce it. Forgive me, I'll be dropping down your class order very quickly if I've got the wrong president. So, is there precedent for a president to simply say, just to ignore the Supreme Court's judgment. I mean, how does the court ultimately enforce its judgments?
Jerry, now you've gotten extra credit. You've gone beyond A+. That is really good, because Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, actually the two presidents who really wrestled with this issue, and Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers, when the Constitution is being ratified, he tells the American people, the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, but it has no power. It doesn't have an army like the president, and it doesn't have the power of the purse like Congress. So Hamilton said the only way that the Supreme Court can get its way is if it persuades us, if what they give are reasons. We voluntarily comply with the Supreme Court, even when we disagree with it, because we find they run their operation. They decide things based on reason and persuasion. And so there are times when presidents have not been persuaded. You put your finger on the two examples. Andrew Jackson. Now, he did suggest that John Marshall should enforce his own opinion. This had to do with the removal of the Cherokee from Georgia, which I think is one of the most shameful things that happened in American history. But more importantly, here's the better example. Andrew Jackson killed off the predecessor to the Federal Reserve Bank. I think this is why Donald Trump has Andrew Jackson's picture in the Oval Office, because I'm sure Donald Trump would love to kill off the Federal Reserve Bank. I'm sure he's studying Jackson closely. So here's the example. The Congress passed the first Bank of the United States, second Bank of the United States, and the Supreme Court upheld it in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. Andrew Jackson said, I don't agree. I think the bank's unconstitutional anyway. I'm vetoing the bank. And so Jackson gave a good example. Here's how I'm not going to follow the court. Abraham Lincoln, I think, had the hardest case because he became president because he disagreed with Dred Scott, the worst decision in Supreme Court history. And Lincoln drew a line, which I think is still the line for how far presidents can go if they disagree with the Supreme Court. He said, I will obey the judgment of Dred Scott, who won and who lost. So if Dred Scott says I have to give Dred Scott the slave back to his former owner, I will do that. But he said, I don't have to accept the Supreme Court's reasons, so I'm not going to voluntarily go out and enforce Dred Scott in other cases unless a court orders me to. So take these cases we're all reading about, Jerry, that you mentioned. If a single judge in Rhode Island says, I want you to not fire this person, or I want you to restore funding for this grant, President Trump could say, okay, I'll do that in that case. But I'm not doing it for anyone outside of Rhode Island. And I'm not doing it for anybody who wasn't present in the courtroom when you issued your judgment, because I don't have to agree with your reasoning. Let's go to the Supreme Court.
Does the court's ruling last year on presidential immunity have any role here in this? I mean, does it make it easier in any way, either legally or just kind of politically almost, for the president to decide he wants to ignore Supreme Court rulings on the grounds that, well, look, I can't be prosecuted because I'm immune from prosecution while I'm in office anyway, and I'm immune from prosecution for official acts when I've left office? I mean, you hear a little bit of that, particularly from sort of left-leaning legal experts, that maybe this emboldens the president and gives him even more scope, perhaps, to defy the court, or do you think it's irrelevant in this instance?
Jerry, not only do you have an A+ and extra credit, but now I suspect you have a private tutor, because nobody, no, this is really, really very good, because very few people have been able to see this important connection you just mentioned between the immunity case, which seems like it's about Donald Trump as a private citizen being prosecuted for things he did when he was once president, between that case and what's going on now. But they're actually directly connected in constitutional law. What Trump is doing now is actually reinforced by that decision. And the reason why is because before the Supreme Court gets to whether former presidents have immunity, it accepted the theory of presidential power that I've been describing earlier. And the theory runs like this. And the Supreme Court Roberts Court has actually been one of the most pro-presidential Supreme Courts in our history. The logic goes like this. The Constitution gives a president the sole responsibility to execute the law. No one else in the Constitution is mentioned. Therefore, everyone in the executive branch who is responsible for carrying out the law is only assisting the president. And so in order to make sure that the president controls all law execution in the country, which is not just prosecution, that's what we think of it mostly, but it's also interpreting the law civil lawsuits, issuing regulations, all the things the executive branch does. The Supreme Court, John Roberts, just 2-3 years ago in a case called Seal Law said, therefore, the president must be able to control everybody who works in the executive branch who executes the law. He must be able to fire them. He must be able to give them orders. They are obligated to carry out his orders. And if they don't, then he has the power to remove them. So that all is established and solidified in the immunity case. And now you could say Trump, like other presidents, other presidents have also put this theory forward, but Trump now has the approval of the Supreme Court when he makes these arguments that I can fire anyone in the executive branch who's carrying out the law. I can shut down USAID. I can fire members of the National Labor Relations Board. They're all in going back to the immunity case and then the Seal Law case that you mentioned. So good for you. You are getting your money's worth out of that private tutor, because that is what's really going on here behind the scenes.
Well, I'm going to keep pushing my luck here a little bit on my skeletal knowledge of constitutional law and say, look, to some extent, this is not quite so hypothetical, is it? Because we already have a case, the TikTok case, where some argue the president is already essentially defying the Supreme Court's judgment. The Supreme Court did rule just before he took office against his wishes that the law passed by Congress that the parent company of TikTok should dispose of TikTok for security reasons. That was passed by Congress despite Trump's efforts. That was upheld by the Supreme Court. But he's come into office and has indicated that he has no intention, or at least he's demanding to use sort of a period in which he might be able to negotiate. So is he already, in a sense, showing that he's willing to defy the Supreme Court on an issue like this? And what can the court do to enforce the law?
This is really, I think, the hardest question that we've faced when we're thinking about presidential power over the last 3 administrations. Actually, I think this was something started by President Obama with his DACA program, President Biden then with his student loan forgiveness program. And this is, as I said earlier, the president's core constitutional authority is to take care the laws are faithfully executed. And we've always recognized presidents have what's called discretion, where they get to pick and choose what cases to prosecute, because they can't prosecute. We don't have enough resources or time. We probably wouldn't want to prosecute every single violation of law in the country. So presidents have now started to say, starting with President Obama, well, I'm just not going to bring any cases. I don't like that law, so I'm going to prosecute 0 people. Does that really give the president a second veto, unreviewable veto on a law? So this is a big problem. So I actually was critical of Donald Trump on the TikTok case, saying, even though the law says by this date, the company must be sold or closed down, President Trump basically said, well, I'm going to take about 70 days before I enforce it. I'm going to drag my feet in the hopes there's a bargain. I think the problem is, even though I don't think President Trump realizes it, what he's doing is actually building a case on the theory that President Obama and President Biden set up, which a lot of conservatives criticized, and I did too, because of, at some point, a president, right, he does have the power of discretion to choose cases, but he can't say, I'm just not going to bring any cases, because that allows him to nullify the law. And that's why the founders put this as, and now, Jerry, I'm going to call on your expertise, because this came from British constitutional history, because apparently at the time of the founding, British kings would say, I can cancel laws that I don't like. And so the founders put this phrase in, I believe, in response to the British monarchy, and said, the executive can't actually decide which laws to cancel or not. He does have to faithfully execute all of them.
But that sounds as though Donald Trump is not doing that with TikTok, and therefore, how much confidence should we have that he will do so if the Supreme Court rules against him in these cases of these executive orders?
This is another example of how a lot of constitutional law, as I said, is about persuasion, because it may not be the Supreme Court that needs to directly order President Trump to do something or not. Because if President Trump is out there trying to sell the company, but it's in violation of the law, and this is where the Wall Street Journal is the expert, not me, how are the private markets going to react? How are investors going to react? The TikTok law doesn't just say TikTok must be sold or closed. It also says anybody who does business with TikTok, any internet company that carries it, any cloud company that stores it, right? Anybody doing business with TikTok is subject to fines, and the fines are billions of dollars of fines. Say I'm a shareholder in Oracle, which I guess hosts TikTok. My stock price might be hit by billions of dollars in liabilities someday. I might want to sue Oracle for doing business with TikTok. State attorney generals might say, we can't allow this federally banned company from doing business in my state. State AGs could bring lawsuits. So President Trump has some ability, right? He can drag his feet, but the rest of the legal system is already going to be reacting to the Supreme Court's decision and to this ban it or sell it law. And I don't think actually that you're going to need the Supreme Court to directly order President Trump to get to it, because the rest of the legal system is going to do it.
All right, let's quickly go through some of these individual cases then and see. You already said you think the birthright citizenship executive order will be overturned. Yes. Why is that?
I think the Supreme Court long ago said birthright citizenship is required by the text of the 14th Amendment. And I just don't think President Trump has much, if any, constitutional backing for his position. So he's going to lose. But he has the right to try to go to the Supreme Court and get them to change its mind and overturn its precedent. But I don't think he's going to succeed.
There's a case where a judge has so far suspended or blocked the attempt to dismantle the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And it does seem to be a congressionally mandated agency, I believe. So is that something that, if it does get to the Supreme Court, it's likely to be upheld?
I think that President Trump's going to win more than 80% of what he wants here, because you're exactly right, Jerry. The president can't cancel or disestablish an agency. But we understand that USAID officials sent out loans after the spending freeze, disobeyed direct presidential orders. So I think President Trump's going to be able to fire a large number of the USAID employees. I think he's going to be able to freeze USAID grants because they interfere with national security and foreign policy. And so because of that, I think President Trump, even if USAID sticks around, what he wants to do with it is fold it into state, have the Secretary of State run it, and have it perform a much more modest role. I think he's going to succeed in that.
What about this case that came up last weekend where the judge in New York blocked essentially Elon Musk and his DOGE team from accessing payment systems in the Treasury? The initial ruling seemed to actually block any political appointee, including the Treasury Secretary and his and other confirmed. Now, the judges yesterday, I think, has rolled back on that and has actually said, no, the Treasury Secretary and any other confirmed politically appointed officials can do this. But how do you see this one playing out?
Oh, this is very interesting because DOGE is a new thing. We haven't seen anything like this before. If Musk and Trump observe the careful line, they will be able to do what they're doing. I often say the way to think about them is to think about us paying our taxes. You know, you, me, we go to an accountant, we show them our books, we say, give me advice on how to file our taxes, what decisions to make. But you and I, we still make the decisions. We still sign the tax return. We still pay the money. DOGE, all it's doing is looking at information, looking at the spending, and giving advice to President Trump and the cabinet about how to use their powers. Then I think what they're doing is well on the side of the law. If they go around, though, if Elon Musk starts firing people and starts cutting the budget himself, well, he doesn't have authority under the Constitution or any statute to do that. And so I think the president, just like the taxpayer, just like the representative, he's allowed to open the books to whoever he wants. The president has, under the Constitution, the right to release information, even classified information, to anybody he wants. The question is, who has the power to do something about it? As long as DOGE stays on the we're just giving people advice side of the line, I think actually this New York judge is going to be overturned.
Could the president say, to Elon Musk or indeed anybody else, appoint any kind of agent of his as a temporary government employee, which is what Musk seems to be, to say, go into any of these agencies and find whatever programs you think are wasteful or abusive or whatever else, and you can cut them. I mean, again, I guess it's a case-by-case basis is the answer. But broadly speaking, does the president have the authority to do that, to sort of designate someone to go in and exercise his authority in eliminating perhaps not necessarily departments, because I understand, again, they may be congressionally mandated, but like whole swathes of spending within departments? Does he have the authority to do that?
He has the authority to ask Musk, go take a look at these things. Find out where there's waste, or fraud, and abuse. The only thing he can't do is say, and then you have the power to cut the spending or to fire the unneeded employees. He still has to make the recommendation to someone else. And you know what, Jay? This is not something new or crazy. The government's been doing it for years with billions of dollars. So say any scientist applies to the federal government and says, I want a grant to conduct research on cancer. Dr. Fauci or whoever doesn't just decide right on the spot. They actually farm out those applications to boards of scientists. to external reviewers. I've been an external reviewer for federal grant applications. They go to experts and they say, take a look at this, look at our programs, give us advice about whether to spend billions of dollars or this on millions of dollars on that. Actually, Americans should want the president to try to get more advice and expertise from people outside the government, because I actually think that's where the wisdom and good judgment in our country is out there in our private society amongst the American people, not in this, small stovepipe of government bureaucrats.
All right, John, last question. So you say no constitutional crisis as it stands, and yet we've seen more and more of this attempts by the executive, by the president, to use his authority in ways that can be challenged and are challenged and sometimes overturned. President Obama famously talked about having a pen and a phone and using his executive authority. He did it on a number of occasions, including DACA, the Dreamers program, and it was rejected by the courts. President Biden did it on multiple occasions, most notably over vaccines, but also over student loans, and that was overturned by the courts. We may not be in a crisis, and then obviously Trump is obviously doing it left, right, and center. If we're not in a crisis, are we testing the guardrails of our constitutional democracy in ways that we may find perhaps they're not quite as robust as we thought they were?
I think that's a fair way to put it. I don't think we are moving where the guardrails are or taking them away. But I think President Trump, like a lot of presidents in the past, are bumping up against them because their political incentive is to try to solve the problems that the American people have identified and to fix, and they declared it in the election. And so because we have this power vacuum in Congress, nobody says, okay, because of the results of the election, what should Congress do? 1, 2, or 3, right? The first thing everyone does is turn to the president because of the vacuum created by Congress's absence. And that's why the courts are getting involved. If the founders originally, their original guardrail, as you put it, was to have Congress and the president fight all the time. That's what the Federalist Papers describe is the famous phrase is ambition must counteract ambition. The person in the office of the president, the people in Congress, their ambitions, their incentives cause them to fight. But Congress has given up on that. That's why everything now resorts back to the courts, because the institution, the much weaker institution than Congress, but that's the only place that people can still go and challenge the executive. So I think you're right, Jerry. You're going to see a lot of cases. That's because you see an energetic president who's responding to the election results. But the real culprit in all this, I think, Jerry, is you've got a Congress that's not really doing the job that the Constitution set out for it.
That's an admirable summary, John. Thank you very much indeed. John Yoo, Professor of Law, University of California, Berkeley. Thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
It was a great pleasure. Always happy to come back.
Thank you. And I'll take those A pluses you gave me to the nearest law school and demand that I immediately receive my degree. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another episode of Free Expression. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.